Chapter 13. Breland Sharn. Wearing a Syrian uniform cloak to a Brelish garrison wasn't one of Dane's better ideas. Not that it was his plan. Even though they weren't in chains, Dane's uniform was drawing unwanted attention, and they moved swiftly through the streets towards the closest lift. "I think it might be worthwhile to spend a few sovereigns on new clothes, Dane," Jode said. Dane scowled. He knew Jode was right, but he hated the thought of setting aside the uniform. The war was over, and Cyr was no more. But as long as he wore that uniform, the nation still existed in his heart. They walked most of the way in silence, each lost in his or her own thoughts. Pierce approached Dane and spoke quietly. "This situation troubles me, Captain." "What is it?" "You say that we were brought here because this watch captain knew who you were, that he wished to give you a warning." And to gloat, Dane thought, but he kept it to himself. "Yes? How did he know your identity?" "According to your story, the injured god only saw you for a few minutes, and you never spoke your name. Yet this watch captain committed a significant force to apprehend you for what wasn't apparently a non-existent crime." It was just like Pierce to cut to the point of an issue. Many of the social aspects of human behavior were still an enigma to the Warforged soldier, but he had fought for Cyr for almost 30 years, and his sense of tactics was at least as sharp as Dane's. "You're right. And it seems as if they knew where to find us. Could you have been betrayed by our employer, this Alina?" Would you do something like that? Dane let his thoughts drift back, reflecting on his 2 years in her service. "I honestly don't know. I don't see what she would stand to gain." "If you aren't certain this woman can be trusted, why are we working for her?" "It's not that simple, Pierce. We're on our own now. Alina's offering a great deal of gold, and we need money if we're going to survive. I know it's not something you need to think about, but most of us need to eat and drink, and after years of that gruel, I'd like to be able to eat something with some flavor. We need shelter and security, and I want to get my sword back." His voice rose with the last sentence. He took a deep breath to calm his nerves. "Is that so important?" Pierce asked. "The sword you have been given is of similar quality and design. It appears to be almost identical. Why do you need to reclaim your first sword?" "It's not about function. That sword was a gift from my grandfather. It was the blade he carried into battle, and it's all I have left of him. It's the memory, not the weapon." If Pierce had been made human, he might have shrugged. As it was, he paused for a moment, then continued speaking. "If not Alina, what about Uncle Jura? It was his request that led us to Malion's gate. Could it have been a trap of some sort?" "He would have known we were there, but I still don't see the motive. And the guard captain, Grayson, there's nothing I can see that would connect him to Jura. Perhaps it is just a coincidence." "Perhaps." Pierce fell silent. His mithril steel faceplate was impossible to read, as impassive as any statue or helmet. They reached the lift a few minutes later, Good riddance, the lift guard muttered when he saw Dane. I'm staying here, Jode announced as they got ready to board. We still need to investigate Raciel, and we're already here. What? Dane began to protest, but Jode cut him off. You need to get out of here now. As long as you're dressed like that, you're a brawl waiting to happen. And Pierce is almost as bad. He counted out a few sovereigns. Here, get new cloaks for both of you. Something nondescript, brellish. Understood? Dane wasn't used to taking orders from the halfling, but he knew Jode was right. I'll see what I can find here. Why don't you go down to this Harrah's Folly and see what you can find out there? What about the temple? Lay interjected. I beat down a minotaur, and now we're going to forget about it? I doubt it's going anywhere, Jode said. We'll work our way down the tower and get back to it once we're back at the bottom. So, we meet back at the Manticore at, say, the 7th bell? Lay glanced at Dane. After a moment, he nodded. Very well. But watch yourself. Of course, Jode said. And Pierce, make sure to trail back a little. When people are trying to have a nonchalant discussion, well, you attract too much attention. As you wish, Pierce said. Jode produced a few more coins and tossed them to Lay. Here, if you're going to be nosing around the taverns, you'll need to buy a drink or two. Now that's an idea I can get behind, muttered Dane. Each of the districts of Sharn was the size of a village or small town, and like any village or town, each had its own distinctive personality. Between the squalor of high walls and Malian's Gate, the cold militant atmosphere of Daggerwatch, the pretentious luxury of Dallin's Refuge, and the relentless good cheer of Den Ias, Dane had seen more diversity than he had in years. But nothing prepared him for Harrah's Folly. Set halfway down the great tower of Dura, the Folly was a bizarre assortment of spires and small towers. Every building was completely different. Architectural styles, building materials, color schemes. Nothing matched. A traditional Brellish tower of stone and mortar stood next to a gnarled spire of ironal densewood, which appeared to have been carved from the trunk of a single massive tree. A squat keep of red brick dominated a square covered with glittering silver sand. The sky was just as chaotic. The upper levels of the towers were connected by a tangle of bridges, a labyrinth of wood, stone, and rope. Flying creatures were darting in and around the towers. A winged stallion was playing a game of tag with a massive black-feathered owl, and a pair of gold-winged guards passed overhead on hippogriff mounts. What madness is this? Dane murmured. You may have answered your own question, Lay replied. The architect was a man named Harrah Talan, and mad would be a polite way of describing him. She paused by the dense wood tower, studying the irregular crooked walls. According to the stories, he wanted to have buildings reflecting all of the different nations in Galifar, so a visitor from any country would have a place that felt like home. Sounds reasonable enough, but I know the elves of Eberron use wood in most of their structures, but I never heard of them actually living in trees. Oh, they don't. Lay looked up at the higher branches of the tower. When Harrah had constructed buildings for all of the different cultures in the kingdom of Galifar, well, there was still room in the district, so he began looking to other cultures. Riedra, Adar, even the ruins in the demon wastes, and Zendrick. Eventually, even this well ran dry. So he turned to the outer planes for inspiration. I believe this is his vision of what homes would look like in Lamania, the Twilight Forest. The outer planes were one of the greatest mysteries of the world. The sages said there were 13 planes, shadows of reality bound to different aspects of existence. Sages and wise women told fanciful stories about the nature of each plane. The endless battlefields of Shavarath, the brilliant crystalline landscape of Irian, the floating citadels of Serania. As far as Dane was concerned, these descriptions were pure fantasy. He'd heard the legends of mighty wizards traveling to the outer realms, but until he met someone who had actually done it, Dane would treat the stories like any other fable. Still, there was no denying that there were forces that had an influence on the world. Dane could still remember when Eberron aligned with Shevarath in the midst of the last war. The storms of whirling blades had erupted in the midst of battles, shredding the warriors of both sides in a terrifying whirlwind of blood. His grandfather had spoken of the last conjunction with Dolur, the realm of the dead, and how the soldiers that fell in battle simply refused to die. While these conjunctions were rare and temporary, there were places in the world where the touch of the outer planes was always felt. Sharn was one of these. The bond to the plane of Sirania enhanced the powers of flight, and this supported the spells that prevented the vast towers from falling. Lamagno was said to be the heart of the natural world. Studying the strange tree tower, Dane could see how it might fit into such a place. The buildings, the bridges, Lay continued. Some say he was mad, but there are a few artificers in House Cannith who believe differently. My father believed that Harrah's Folly was designed according to a precise formula, that when the planes and moons come into a specific alignment, its true purpose will be revealed. She fell silent, a hint of sorrow crossing her features. She rarely mentioned her parents. They had lived in the Syrian capital of Metrol, and they knew that they had both died in the war some 10 years ago. They had never spoken of the circumstances of their deaths, and Dane had not wished to pry. He let her reflect in silence and examine the streets around them. The inhabitants of Harrah's Folly were almost as diverse as the buildings themselves. Dane could see travelers from every corner of Corvair who'd come to the Folly to participate in the games and spectacles of Sharn. Dane, when Lay spoke again, her voice was soft and thoughtful. Who gave you that sword? A man. His name was Grayson, an old friend. I told you. A member of House Deneath? Yes. But the soldiers of House Deneath give their allegiance to no nation. The house is founded on the principle of mercenary service. How could an heir of Deneath serve as an officer of the Sharn Watch? He was in House Deneath. He left the house. Lay's eyes widened. You mean he was excoriated, like me? I don't think so. I think he chose to leave of his own free will. I've heard of it happening, but it's just it's just hard for me to imagine. Really? Are the other members of your family such wonderful people? I could imagine getting tired of spending my entire life in the company of someone like Lord Jura. Lay shook her head. You can't understand, Dane. The house, it's more than just a family. It's the foundation of life. Being part of the house raises you above any nation, above any race. As a girl, I dreamed of the day that my mark would appear and allow me to be a part of the work of my house. She stopped walking, her eyes glistening in thoughts far away. Kings come and go. It is the dragon-marked houses that have shaped Corvair. Look at what Cannith has done in the last century alone. We gave birth to a new race. She broke off and took a deep breath. Dane put his hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be a part of a house to make a difference. There's the 12, the Arcane Congress. Lay pushed his hand aside, blinking back tears. You don't understand. It's... She reached up and rubbed the small of her back, just below her neck. Though it was usually covered, Dane knew that this was where her dragon mark was located. It's what I was born for. It's who I am. How could anyone throw that away? Dane knew she didn't really want an answer, but he couldn't help it. Well, what about Jode? How does he fit in with this? The question seemed to shock Lay out of her reverie. Jode made no efforts to conceal his dragon mark, yet he had never spoken of his connection to House Jurasko, the halfling house of healing. I don't know. I tried to bring it up once before, but he changed the subject and I didn't want to press. He might have been expelled, but it's always possible that he's a foundling. What do you mean? The change in subject allowed Lay to fall back on her role as sage and lecturer as they began walking again. You know that the dragon marks are bound to bloodlines, yes? Since the marks are tied to the family line of the house, they remain within the house. It's one reason people who bear a particular dragon mark often share similar physical traits. But when you have an excoriate, he still carries the power of the mark and can pass it on to offspring. Thus, it's possible for a child to be born outside the house and yet to possess the mark of the house. I think that's what you see with Jode. A man with the gift of Jurasko, but with no actual tie to the house. I'd think the house wouldn't approve of that. Someone interfering with their monopoly on the mark. What's to stop a group of outsiders from starting a new house? Well, that's more or less what has happened with the elves. Though the split came from inside the house. But you're right. It's something that has always been discouraged. You have to understand, it's exceedingly rare for someone to be punished in this way. Uncle Jura is the only excoriate I've ever met. As Jode said before, they used to kill excoriates. Even after that practice was ended, excoriates were often castrated or maimed. Since the rise of Galifar, these practices have been discouraged. Over the last few centuries, most of the houses passed rules allowing foundlings to apply for admittance into the house. Unless the parent was some sort of incarnate fiend, there's nothing to be gained by punishing the child. And yet we have Jode. Look, I don't know. Ask him. Dane shook his head. Better left alone. They walked a little further. You changed the subject, Lay said. I still don't understand why your friend Grayson would leave the house. But given that he did, why would he keep that sword? And why give it to you? Well, Dane ran his fingers along the hilt of the sword. You're right. The soldiers of Denith cannot give their allegiance to any king or queen. Their loyalty belongs to the house first, and pay master second. Whoever that may be. Apparently, Grayson found something, or someone, who became more important to him than the house. I imagine he had to leave to be with her. so it's not like, well, what's happened to you. He may have wanted to keep the memory of his achievements within the house, so he kept the sword. As for why he gave it to me, I couldn't tell you. He knew I didn't have a sword, and wanted to rub my face in it, he thought. This is a fine blade, and obviously, I'll never be able to wield it without thinking of him. It was close enough to the truth, and Lei seemed to accept it. Lei stopped again, and looked at him critically. You have a bit of the Denise look, you know? The color of your hair, those dark blue eyes, even the shape of your eye. I don't know why I've never noticed it before. Dane shrugged. Perhaps there's a foundling in my family tree. I suppose it would explain why Grayson and I were such good friends. Lei nodded. I suppose it might, at that. Anyhow, we're here. What? Lei gestured at the building next to them. Dane had been so absorbed in the conversation that he hadn't been paying attention to their surroundings. He glanced over at their destination and blinked. The King of Fire was unlike any tavern he'd ever seen. A squat tower of black stone inlaid with sigils of gleaming brass. It seemed like it should be the fortress of an evil wizard plucked out of fey tales. But the square sign above the door had the unmistakable look of an inn post, bearing the image of a deck of playing cards, with the King of Fire showing on the top. As he watched, a trio of drunken gnomes came staggering out of the building. All three of them needed to lean against the door to push it open. What is it? Dane asked. Lei had produced Alina's packet of parchments. It's supposed to be the primary center for gambling in the tower, especially for betting on aerial sports, such as the Race of 8 Winds. Jode's thought was that we might be able to get information about Raciel from some of the patrons. As for the design, I imagine it was inspired by the stories of the fiery plain of Fernia? Anyway, are you ready to go in? Dane glanced around, looking for Pierce. Given his size and unusual appearance, the Warforged soldier had a gift for concealment, and it took Dane a moment to pick him out against the shadows. He gave Pierce a hold and watch sign with his right hand, and Pierce nodded almost imperceptibly. All right, let's see what we can find. All right, Dane said. Let's see what we can find. Chapter 14. The tables were on fire. The walls and floor of the King of Fire were the same black stone as the exterior. Mystical symbols were carved into the walls and inlaid with brass. Set against the dark stone, they almost seemed to be floating in midair. There were no torches, nor chandeliers. The light came from the chairs and tables themselves. Half a dozen round tables carved from dark wood and inscribed with the same symbols as the walls were spread around the common room. Cold fire had been woven into the wood of the tables, and these insubstantial flames cast long shadows across the walls. People were laughing and talking, and the rattle of dice and flutter of shuffling cards filled the air. Welcome! What are you looking for? The voice seemed to come from thin air, but as his eyes adjusted to the strange lighting, Dane realized that there was a slender halfling woman standing next to him. She had short, dark hair and wore a black dress embroidered with the same symbols that could be seen on the walls. Can I get a flagon of Carluat? He asked. He had developed a taste for the pitchy brew while serving with a troop of Dargul mercenaries. Lei made a face, but the halfling nodded. Oh, absolutely. Noticing Lay's expression, she said, "A lot of people think the gargoyle has a strong chance this year, and we're expecting to have a lot of goblins up from Malian's Gate to get a closer view. Now, what can I get for you, dear?" "B- Blackroot Tal," Lay said. "Very well. Take any open stool, and I'll be right back. I'm Kella. Just call if you need anything." As if in response, a burly half-orc bellowed her name from across the room, and she scurried away. They found an empty table and sat down. Dane found it difficult to set his hands down on the smoldering table. No heat flickered from the flames that covered the table, no crackle or smoke, but it was still difficult to overcome his instincts. Lay had no such trouble. She set her elbows on the table and gazed into the silvery flames. She looked over at him, and there was sorrow in her eyes. "I remember my first lessons with eternal fire," she said, her voice distant. "My mother had woven the flame into the lining of a small wooden casket. I used to keep it by my bed, so I always had light at my side when the wind rose and the shadows seemed threatening." Her voice drifted off. Dane wanted to let her reminisce, to work through her emotions and her loss, but there simply wasn't time. "Lay." Her misty eyes cleared, and she looked up at him. "Yes." "We need information. We don't have enough money for bribes, and with Jode busy, well, you know, I'm not a master of diplomacy." "True enough." Eh, thanks. Anyhow, without Jode, you'd better prepare a charmer." Lay nodded. She pulled a small shard of quartz from her belt pouch and began to polish it with a piece of fox's fur, whispering quietly. As Lay wove an enchantment into the stone, Dane examined the common room. A number of people played games of chance, but these appeared to be friendly contests, and from the stream of people moving to and fro, Dane gathered that there was a formal gaming hall farther in the building. Patrons of the king came from all races and nations. Glancing around the room, Dane could see a gnome on a tall stool playing around of sundown with an elderly man and a burly half-orc. A pair of shifters were dicing against a trio of Valinar elves. An elf woman cried out in triumph as she made a difficult roll, and one of her opponents bared long fangs in a frustrated snarl. Dane's wandering gaze finally fixed on a woman who had just emerged from the inner hall. She was wrapped in a dark flowing cloak, and only her face was visible. Even that was shadowed under a voluminous hood. What caught Dane's attention were her eyes, large and green, glowing like emeralds in the magic firelight. She held his gaze for a long moment, a hint of a smile playing over her lips. Then she looked away, and the spell was broken. She knelt and spoke to the innkeeper, then disappeared out the front door. A moment later, Kella arrived at their table, carrying their drinks. Lay was absorbed in her work and didn't look up when the mug of steaming tal was placed before her. Dane swirled the sludgy corduat about in the tankard. Uh, what do we owe you?" he said. "It's already been taken care of," the tiny innkeeper said. "By?" "The lady who just left. I saw you looking at her. I'm afraid I don't know her name. Kalashtar, I think." Kalashtar. Dane had heard of the Kalashtar, but had never actually met one before. Tales said the Kalashtar were possessed, that their ancestors were humans who had sold their bodies to ghosts or spirits from another plane. They were supposed to have unnatural powers over mortal minds. Of course, These same storytellers claimed House Cannith made the Warforged by binding the spirits of the dead into shells of wood and metal, and that the dragon-marked houses had actual dragons hidden in their basements. Still, he could see how such stories could arise. Her gaze had been hypnotic, but she was gone, and it was a mystery for another day. If the Corluat is free, I've got a few crowns to spare, Dane said, tossing a coin in the air. Perhaps you could help me do something about that? We aim to please, my lord, Kella said with a smile. What's your pleasure? I'm new to Sharn, and I'm intrigued by these races. Wind chases, is that right? Indeed. If this is your first time to Sharn, I assure you, after you've seen a wind chase, then chariots, horses, and hounds will hold no interest. Well, I'm looking for a mentor, someone who can tell me how the game is played, who to keep an eye on, who's won in the past. I like to know what I'm getting into before I take risks. Anyone around who might help me with that sort of stuff? Kella nodded. I expect that Deck will be happy to help you for a few crowns. I'll see if he's free. Dane tossed her a coin. She deftly caught it and threw it back at him. Save it for the games, she said with a smile, before disappearing into the crowd. A few minutes later, Dane approached them and sat down, or so it seemed. I hear you're interested in the races, the newcomer said, while his face was a perfect mirror of Dane's. His voice was too high, and he was dressed in loose brown clothing. A changeling. Dane hated changelings. That's right, he said, placing a few crowns on the table. But I've never liked talking to myself. His twin passed a hand over the coins and they vanished. My apologies. Some people don't like to see their own faces. The pigment slowly ran out of his skin, and white film spread across his eyes. His hair grew out, becoming fair and wispy. His facial features seemed to melt away, leaving only a hint of nose and lips. It's the scar, isn't it? You're not comfortable with it yet. Let's stick to the games, Dane said. Touchy. So why don't you tell me what you want to know, and we'll see what it's worth. Dane caught Lay's eye and blinked twice. She pulled out the polished quartz shard. We don't have much to offer, she said shyly. But we do have this. She held the stone out toward the changeling, and as he reached for it, she muttered a swift, triggering incantation. Patterns of light and mist seemed to swirl about in the depths of the stone. With some difficulty, Dane pulled his eyes away. It was a calculated risk. If the charmer worked, Deck would think of Lay as an old friend. But if it failed and he realized what happened, at the very least, they'd be thrown out of the King of Fire, and changelings were known for their slippery minds. But they didn't have money to spare, and they needed to be able to trust the information they received. The light faded. Lay left the stone on the table, slowly. Deck picked up the crystal shard. He seemed slightly dazed. Lay caught Dane's eye and nodded slightly. I know it's not much, but I wanted you to have it, Lay said, putting her hand on that of the changeling. Something to remember me by? Thank you, Deck said, and his voice was suddenly a mirror of hers. A swirl of coppery color ran through his hair, then faded away. What was it you wanted to know again? I'm afraid I blacked out for a moment. Lay asked questions about the aerial races of Sharn. Deck was only too happy to help his new best friend, and he told them all about the different sports, skyblade jousts, the wind-chasing routes that wound through the maze of spires, and the race of 8 winds, an ancient tradition dating back to the early days of Sharn. The race is incredibly important to the people of this tower, Deck explained. Each district is associated with one of the 8 beasts that can compete in the race. As the race draws near, you'll see the inhabitants of each district wearing the colors of their beast or showing their allegiance in other ways. There are feasts and games for weeks before and after the race. Of course, tempers grow high. There are long feuds based on past performance, and occasionally it turns into violence. I don't understand, Lay said. How could a griffin possibly compete in a race against a hippogriff? The hippogriff is far faster. There's more to the race of 8 winds than speed, Deck explained. The rider is allowed to carry a small crossbow and a quiver of quarrels coated with a weak venom. Not enough to kill a creature, but strong enough to slow it down. And the beasts are allowed to use claw, tooth, and beak. I've never seen the griffin win the race, but 1 or 2 of the other contestants usually fall prey to its claws. The people of Precarious don't expect to win. They just want to see who the griffin will take down. But while it was before my time, the griffin has won the race before, and I'm sure it will again. The Wind Guard, the handlers, racers, and organizers spend the time between races negotiating and scheming. The Griffin's services are bought with future favors, and eventually those all come due. But the faster beasts usually win? Well, yes. It's often really a race between the Pegasus and the Hippogriff, with all the rest following in a pack. But I've seen some interesting things before. Many of the racing beasts are intelligent after all. I've heard a rumor that the current owl is studying magic to enhance her speed with wizardry, though that seems a bit far-fetched. The gargoyle is a recent addition replacing the bat. He's a surprisingly tricky beast, and the goblins love him. I wouldn't be surprised if he pulls it off one of these years. Lay, Dane whispered, can we get to the point? We've got a dinner appointment. She nodded. This is fascinating information, Deck, but I was wondering if you could tell me about one of the riders? A human named Raciel Tan, who used to race with a hippogriff. Deck thought for a moment, then his face brightened. Literally. Yes, Raciel. I remember him now. He started out doing the lesser wind chases, aerial jousts in the hollow tower and the like. His first time in the race of 8 winds was 991, I think. He won the year after that. One of the finest hippogriff riders I've seen, and a good man by all accounts. Gold Wing Guard, you know. Terrible loss for the hippogriff. Rallus, their new rider, isn't nearly as good. New rider? What happened to Raciel? Well, he had a series of accidents, the first of which cost him victory in the race of 8 winds. After the third death, he left for good. Death? During the last race, it seemed that Raciel might bring home a second victory for the hippogriff. He was neck to wing with the Pegasus rider, and closing in on the hollow tower. Then his mount died. Just like that. Raciel was almost killed. He broke free from the saddle with just enough time to use his token of the winds. But another moment, and he would have been nothing but a stain. How did the hippogriff die? Was it poison? Well, the poisons used in the race are very weak. The goal is to give the rider a chance to slow down his enemies, not to kill them outright. Raciel's mount may have been hit by the gargoyle, I think. But the crossbow and bolts are presented to the racing authorities at the start of the game, and the riders are carefully searched for contraband before the race. Of course, there wasn't enough left of the body to do any sort of testing, but from what I heard, according to Ratio, simply died without warning, healthy one moment, dead the next. Lay nodded. Even though no one exactly knew what happened, it seemed clear enough that it was the work of one of the other seven beasts, and the Hippogriff Wind Guard was investigating it. Then, a week later, Raciel lost another mount. This time, during the Kelsa chase, a race with far lower stakes. The exact same thing, only this time, he couldn't get free in time. Luckily, it was a low altitude race, but he still broke his leg. They noticed a motion near the wall. There was a rat in the shadows watching him. Dane was surprised to see rats in a place as stylish as the King of Fire. There was a pair of dice on the table, and he slipped one into his palm. With a quick motion, he threw the die at the rat, striking it dead center. The rodent squeaked and scampered out of sight. Smiling, Dane turned his attention back to the conversation. Were any of Racio's opponents in this Kelsa race people who had ridden against him in 8 wins? Lay asked. Just one, Mulg Oranan, a hawk rider. But even the Hippogriff Windguard couldn't find anything suspicious. What happened next? Racio recovered from the injury, but he never returned to the races. There were rumors, but, well, it's better not to say. Lay rubbed his hand. Oh, come now, Deck. You know you can trust me. They say he got involved with the Darkanans, which doesn't make any sense. He was a Goldwing, but that's what I heard. Tarkanans? Lay asked. A group of thieves and assassins. I don't know much about them, and I don't want to. If you want someone dead by morning, the Tarkanans can make it happen. What Raciel could possibly have in common with those cutthroats, I couldn't tell you. As far as I know, he never killed anyone, even in his tenure with the Watch. But last I heard, he'd been seen in their company. Where could we find these Tarkanans, Deck? Look, as a friend, I don't know what your interest is here, but you don't want to cross the Tarkanans. Whatever it is, just let it go. Don't worry, Deck. We'll be all right. Where can we find them? Deck shivered, and for a moment his features shook like jelly. I don't know. Honest, I don't. I follow the races. I'm not a thug. I've heard they're somewhere in Dragon Towers, in the Central Plateau, but it's not worth it. There are some things better left alone. That's enough, Dane said, standing up. We need to get moving. And we've got something to work with. Thank you so much, Deck, Lay said with a brilliant smile. I knew I could rely on you. If we ever can afford to put money on one of those races, we'll certainly come to you. Oh, my pleasure, Deck said. Anything for a friend. Here, I suppose you'd better take these back. He tossed Dane the coins he'd been given earlier and smiled. I'll see you around. Chapter 15. Watching Dane and Lay enter the inn, Pierce clung to the scant shadows of the alley, his mithril plating blending into the darkness. He had been built to serve as a scout and skirmisher, and a talent for stealth had been forged into his soul. He held his great bow in one hand, an arrow at the ready. There was no sign of danger, but Pierce had been a soldier since the day he was born, and he never lowered his guard. The city felt strange and unnatural to Pierce. He was 28 years old, and he had spent his entire life on the battlefields of Seir. Even after Seir was destroyed, exploring the Mornland was much like fighting a war. Horrors far more dangerous than any Brelish soldier filled the devastated land. It was hard for him to conceive a life without conflict, to look at the bustling street without evaluating the threat posed by each traveler. A part of him yearned for a sudden attack, an ambush, something that would justify his vigilance. Do you miss war so much? The voice was soft and warm, as was the hand that touched his shoulder. During the siege of Felmar Valley, the Valinar elves had played games with the Siren defenders, killing sentries and leaving the corpses standing at their posts. After a time, Pierce began playing a game of his own, making himself an invited target, then bringing down any elf who thought he could approach undetected. He'd caught 5 would-be assassins this way, though he had a few arrow marks from elves who'd wisely chosen not to play his game. But no one had ever come close enough to touch him without his noticing. Until now. It was not in Pierce's nature to fear for his life. He was made to fight, and if he died in battle, he would know that he had served his purpose. Rather than fear, he felt a deep sense of disappointment at his failure to spot this potential threat and the need to regain the upper hand as quickly as possible. He turned to face the stranger and took a long step back, trying to get enough room to draw back his bow. But even as he stepped away, the stranger moved forward, perfectly matching his stride. She wore a dark cloak with a deep hood, and she moved as silently and smoothly as a shadow, remaining inches from his chest. Pierce was at a loss. This woman had taken no directly hostile action, and the folds of the cloak suggested her hands were empty. He was larger and presumably stronger than her. Should he drop the bow and lash out with a steel fist? Or was this some sort of misunderstanding? I suppose in battle, the answers are always clear, she said. Her voice was low and musical. Had Pierce been made from flesh and blood, it might have sent a shiver down his spine. As it was, he merely noted the clarity and enunciation, the unknown accent that suggested a homeland beyond the 5 nations. If you mean me no harm, back away slowly. The woman took a few steps back. My apologies, she said. She looked up to meet his gaze, and her hood fell back far enough to reveal her pale skin and finely sculptured features. Green eyes glowed within a halo of black hair, and her lips twisted with the slightest hint of a smile. To Pierce's eyes, she seemed human, though it was hard to tell for certain, with the shadows and the hood. I have little experience with your kind, she said. I didn't mean to startle you. I was not startled, Pierce replied. The stranger's smile widened ever so slightly, and Pierce wondered why he felt the need to defend himself. He sat down the bow and pulled his flail off his back. The woman was unarmed, but still he felt the need to be prepared for battle. You didn't answer my question. If she felt threatened by the flail, she didn't show it. What do you want with me? Pierce was used to dealing with allies and enemies. Abstract conversation was not something he'd had much time for on the battlefield. He'd listened to the lady and the captain argue with one another, and he enjoyed the healer's wordplay. But he wasn't used to being the target of such things?
The answer to a question, nothing more. Do you have a place in a world without war?
Her eyes flickered down to encompass the flail.
Or are you just a weapon, worthless, when there is no blood to be spilled?
Pierce stared at her, trying to find the words to answer. It was not a new question. In fact, it was what he'd been asking himself before the stranger showed up. Did she know that? Even as he searched for an answer, he caught the glimpse of emotion in his peripheral vision. Two figures stepping into the alley. The possible threat was a welcome release from the question, and he relaxed and let his reflexes take over, stepping back against the wall and setting the chain of his flail in motion. But there was no threat, just Captain Dane and Lady Lay exiting the tavern. Captain Dane eyed the spinning flail, glanced at the bow on the ground, and his hand went to the hilt of his sword. "What's wrong?" Pierce let the flail come to a stop. "Nothing, Captain. A misunderstanding. I was just—" He glanced toward the stranger. But she was nowhere to be seen. If he'd had eyelids, Pierce would have blinked in surprise. She had slipped away as smoothly as she had appeared. "Thinking," he finished. The captain shrugged. "Let's get moving then. I'll fill you in along the way." Pierce nodded. He returned his flail to its harness and picked up his bow, studying the empty alley. He listened to Dane's words, but his thoughts were far away.